All right, we can probably go ahead and get started since I see there's like a decent amount of people that have logged on. So welcome everyone. My name is Nathan Silverstein. I'm the founder and president of the Polish Club at the University of Texas at Austin. This event is being recorded and will be posted on the Polish Club's website, where we have a virtual library of recordings of all our past guest speakers. Today's event is being hosted by the Polish Club at UT, a registered student organization. This is not an event sponsored by the University of Texas at Austin. The views expressed today are of the invited guest speaker and do not represent the views of the student organization, the university, or its officers. I would like to thank our co-sponsors, UT Center for Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies, the Center for European Studies, Liberal Arts Honors, Texas Global, the Schusterman Center for Jewish Studies, and Texas Hillel. I'm excited to introduce today's speaker, CEO of the Jewish Community Center, or JCC, in Krakow, Mr. Jonathan Ornstein. Mr. Ornstein has served as the CEO of the JCC in Krakow since the center's opening in 2008. Under Mr. Ornstein's leadership, the JCC has grown to have over 850 members and welcomes 10,000 visitors per month. The JCC has also played a major role in providing humanitarian assistance to Ukraine and Ukrainian refugees in Poland. The center has sent over $9 million of direct support to Ukraine. Overall, the JCC has helped over 200,000 Ukrainians, whether it be having provided free meals, shelter, language instruction, or some other service. Today, Mr. Ornstein will be delivering a 20-minute speech entitled "The Rebirth of Jewish Life in Poland." He will also discuss the JCC's humanitarian efforts regarding Ukraine. Mr. Ornstein will then take moderated Q&A for around 40 minutes. I've selected the most interesting questions from the audience and will ask them anonymously. It is my distinct honor to now welcome a great Jewish leader, Mr. Jonathan Ornstein.
Thank you very much, Nathan. What an honor to be here. You're very impressive, and your club is very impressive. I've been following. We've been in touch for a while, and it's impressed me from a distance. And I'm honored to be one of your guests. I know you've had many wonderful guests. You had recently the ambassador. The U.S. ambassador to Poland, who was a guest here in Krakow recently. It was a few weeks ago. He was a great guy. So it's great to be part of that. I will just one thing in your very warm, generous introduction. We sent $9 million of aid to Ukraine. So that number is about 10 million now, and it's not that we sent it to Ukraine, but 10 million of aid we've delivered into Ukraine, and mostly to Ukrainian refugees in Krakow. So not necessarily inside Ukraine, but I'll talk all about that when we get to the Ukrainian piece. But just to clarify, great. So. Poland, in a Jewish perspective, is a very, very interesting place. Poland is seen for most Jews, for obvious reasons, through the prism of the Holocaust. And Poland is known as a place of tragedy, as a place of suffering. People see Poland, if you ask Jewish people around the world to close their eyes and think of Poland, they imagine a Poland in black and white. And if you ask them to play word association about Poland, they might say Poland, and you say Poland, and they say Holocaust, and you say Krakow, and they say Auschwitz. But that's not the entire story. There's something else going on today from a Jewish perspective, which is, I think, quite remarkable and quite counterintuitive. Maybe I'll just begin with a short story. A few years ago, there were two sisters. Two sisters in Krakow who grew up Catholic, as most everyone else is, not very religious, but certainly nothing Jewish. And at their parents split up when the girls were young, and the father left the country, and they had nothing to do with the father or his side of the family. They didn't know anything about him really, too much. At a certain point, one of the sisters got curious and discovered that her father actually was Jewish, and that sister got very involved in Jewish life and started to, connect and learn what it means to be Jewish. Her sister, not very interested. Finally, the one sister that was involved brought her younger sister to the JCC, to a Hanukkah party where she met a certain high-ranking individual, and she got a little more interested in her Jewish life, her Jewish background, and they actually got married and now have a 1-year-old baby. And this is actually not only just a random story, this is the story of my wife and my story. So young people like my wife, and I get credit, although she's not on the call, I'll get eternal credit for referring to her as a young person. Young people in Poland today, in great numbers, are finding out that they're Jewish. And this story, whether it's a story like my wife, whether it's people have come in who just were looking through their grandparents' attic and found photos, black and white photos from before the war of people with beards and with strange hairstyles, and did a little research and realized that their family actually was Jewish. So people are finding out they're Jewish in all kinds of ways. And it's not necessarily obvious how that's happening. Who are these people? How do we get to a point in 2023 where a country, Poland, with such a strong Jewish history, now has people finding out that they're Jewish? So maybe we'll go a little bit back into the history. So I mentioned Poland was a very Jewish place. I think this much most people know. Even from a Jewish perspective, we don't always realize how Jewish Poland was. Polish Jewish history is 1,000 years of history. The first documented presence of Jews in Poland was 1,000 years ago. There's even the name for Poland in Hebrew is Polin, which is also the name of the Museum of Jewish History in Warsaw, which opened a few years ago. Wonderful museum. But Polin in Hebrew really means here they stayed. This idea that the Jews found a refuge here in Poland. Of course, it wasn't always a refuge, but it was for much of Polish Jewish history a refuge. So that 1,000 years, if we go in the 18th century, about 300 years ago, Polish Jews were 75% of the Jews on the planet. 3 out of every Jews in the world was living in Poland. Now, not necessarily Poland by today's borders, Poland by somewhat larger, by expanded borders, but still, Poland was, the vast majority of Jews living on the planet a few hundred years ago were living in Poland. On the eve of World War II, 1939, there were 3.5 million Jews living in Poland in a country of 35 million. 10% of the population was Jewish. The United States today is about 1.5, under 2% Jewish. Poland was 10% Jewish. Cities like Warsaw was a third Jewish. Krakow, where I live, a quarter Jewish. Cities in the east, Lublin, Białystok, cities could be over 50% Jewish. There are no cities today anywhere, large cities anywhere on earth outside of Israel, that are as Jewish as these cities in Poland were. We often have a view in the Jewish world that the Jews in Poland were living completely in these little villages and shtetls, separate from mainstream society, which was part of the narrative, but absolutely not the complete narrative. They're living in the cities. And a remarkable statistic for me is that in 1939, 60% of the lawyers and 40% of the doctors in Poland were Jewish, right? In a population of 10%. So the middle class of Poland, massively, massively Jewish. September 1st, 1939, Germany invades from one side, Soviet Union invades 16 days later from the other side. And by the end of World War II, by the middle of 1945, by the end of the Holocaust, you have over 90% of Polish Jews murdered by the Germans and their accomplices in Europe. And a lot of that takes place on occupied Polish soil, of course. From the Jewish perspective, we know there were survivors. The survivors picked up and left and went to Texas and New York and Buenos Aires and Palestine, eventually Israel, to London. The survivors left Poland in our general narrative. But the thing is that not all the survivors left. And some of the Jews stayed in Poland for all different reasons. And during communism, Jewish life limped on. It was, of course, a tiny shadow of what it was before the war, but there were synagogues functioning, there were schools that were still functioning until really 1968. And 1968, without getting too deep into it, 2 things happened in 1968. One was there were a lot of student uprisings around Europe. There was a split in the Communist Party, and one side of the Communist Party had more Jews in it, and there was the other side, this other faction of the Communist Party essentially use that use the Jewish membership of that other side in the power struggle and say that, oh, these Jews are not loyal communists, they're not loyal to the party. And this was after 1967, after the Six-Day War, which of course the Soviet Union and its client states, it's the countries in its client states is probably being a little too kind. Soviet Union and the countries controlled by the Soviet Union, including Poland, had backed the Arab states and were not very happy with the outcome of the Six-Day War, of Israel winning this war. So there was a big push saying that the Jews in Poland were Zionists and they weren't loyal to Poland and they weren't welcome, and the Jews were encouraged to leave. And many of the Jews did. I think the official number is about 15 or 20,000 of the remaining Jews left Poland. Many went to the Scandinavian countries. And this really broke the back of Polish Jewry. I mean, of course, the Holocaust was the main issue and irrevocably changed Polish Jewry and decimated Polish Jewry. But there was some form of Polish Jewry continuing. And then in 1968, many of the Jews left. And the ones who stayed made a decision that is still affecting us today, which is they went underground. They changed their names, they hid their identities. They very often didn't tell their own children that they were Jewish. And this was the situation until the end of communism. For the next 20 years, there was really not much Jewish life at all going on in Poland. In 1989, communism ends, and Poland wakes up from a 50-year-long bad dream. And World War II was only 6 years, 5.5 years of that 50 years. But in some sense, you could really say that World War II lasted for 50 years in Poland. Poland was free in 1939, and then the next time it was free was 1989. And Poles wake up and they look at themselves in a newly democratic, free country. And one of the major differences between the last time that they were free, 50 years earlier, and 1989, is that this massive minority of Jews that had been living there for 1,000 years, good times and bad, was gone. And I think Poles in 1989 wanted to continue this dialogue that had been going on, this unfinished dialogue. There was no closure, right? You have millions of Jews living in the country. The Jews are murdered and forced out and driven underground, and nobody really dealt with it, right? What was taught in the schools during communism was not really focused on the Holocaust or focused on Jewish suffering. It was whatever the Soviet Union allowed Poland to teach, which was the suffering of everybody at the hands of the fascists. The Jews weren't singled out as suffering during the Holocaust. So there was no real closure. And Polish non-Jews in 1989 become very interested in this open question of the Jews, of what happened to the Jews. Now, everybody knew what happened with the Holocaust, but nobody really dealt with the ramifications and repercussions. So Poles start to do something interesting. They start to write books, and they start to listen to klezmer music, and they start to open museums about the Jews. They start Jewish culture festivals, like, the fascinating fact that the Jewish Culture Festival in Krakow is started at the end of communism, right before communism ended, by two Polish non-Jews, one of whom is still running it, and it's considered the largest Jewish culture festival in Europe, if not the world, with Jews and non-Jews playing all this music to a mixed crowd in its 32nd or 33rd year, with tens of thousands of participants. So there starts to be this tremendous amount of interest in everything Jewish in Poland. In Krakow, in 1993, Steven Spielberg comes and films Schindler's List, which ignites a lot of interest in Jewish Poland, especially in Krakow, in the Jewish quarter where I'm sitting now, called Kazimierz, which actually is the best preserved Jewish quarter anywhere in Europe. We have 7 renovated pre-war synagogues. The youngest is from 1862, and the oldest is from the 15th century. And they're all within a 10-minute walk of where I'm sitting right now. So you have an intact Jewish neighborhood. You have Steven Spielberg coming and filming and starting to create this interest in Jewish Jewish Krakow. You have all these non-Jews that can't continue the dialogue that had been going on with their grandparents and over the centuries. So they become interested in this almost lost culture. And that has created the environment that we at the JCC in Krakow are operating in. So the next sort of step in our history is Prince Charles, actually now King Charles, who came to visit in Krakow in 2002. And as part of his state visit, he came to the Jewish quarter and he met with some Holocaust survivors. He met with 4 or 5 Holocaust survivors in one of the cafes that had opened since Steven Spielberg came to town. And he asked these survivors how we could help them. And they said, we have all these synagogues, we have a place to pray. What we're missing is a place to be together, like a Jewish senior citizen center. And Prince Charles was moved and said he promised them that he would help them realize their dream of having a senior citizen center in Krakow. And he went back to the UK and got involved with a Jewish organization there that did a bit of research, and they realized that it wasn't only this Holocaust survivor population that was trailing off, that young people were starting to find out that they were Jewish. So people like my wife, people, people in that age range were starting in all different ways to find out from their parents, from their grandparents, from their great-grandparents that they were actually Jewish. And the fascinating thing is that they were eager to act upon it, right? If you find out you're Jewish in a terrifying environment, in an environment rife with anti-Semitism, then you're going to keep that a secret. You're not going to act on it. But these young people in the early 2000s were starting to meet and try to connect. And do you know anybody? Yeah, this one's father's Jewish, and I found out my mother and my grandmother's Jewish, and what do we do? And what does it mean to be Jewish? So this was the environment that was going on after Prince Charles's visit. And they came up with the idea of, instead of doing only a senior citizen center, the original plan, according to the prince, what the survivors in Krakow needed, that they would do something even larger, like a JCC, a community center, to try to draw in these young people who are finding out they're Jewish, take care of the Holocaust survivors, but also serve as a hub. And maybe, just maybe, this center could help rebuild Jewish life in a city that officially had a tiny amount of Jews, but that everybody kind of knew that people were really Jewish and around, and they just needed a place maybe to congregate. So with Prince Charles's financial support, this organization, World Jewish Relief, was able to raise the money in London. And in 2008, now the King and Queen, then the Prince of Wales and Duchess of Cornwall, Charles and Camilla, came to Krakow and spent the day with us and opened the JCC. And we've been open for 15 years. And I think, at least certainly according to the King, who's stayed in constant contact with us over the years, he's very impressed by our progress. So we have a center, been open for 15 years. What do we do with the center? What's going on here? We have a preschool, which is the first Jewish preschool to open since the Holocaust. We have teen program for some of their, some of our your Jewish viewers might know the program, the organization BBYO, or you mentioned Hillel. We have Hillel also here in Krakow, which is run in conjunction with our JCC. We have over 50 Holocaust survivors that we're taking care of that have designated space in the building. We have Shabbat dinner every week, like we'll have tonight, about 140 people coming for Shabbat dinner. We celebrate all Jewish holidays. We have a genealogist on staff. We publish a newspaper. We have a Jewish choir. We have hundreds of people learning Hebrew and people learning Arabic and people learning Yiddish. We have Jews and non-Jews working here. We have tons of non-Jewish volunteers who are helping us rebuild Jewish life. And the center has become, in 15 years, really a center, this idea of, a center of the rebirth of Jewish life. You mentioned 850 Jewish members here, but also a place that people visit. In 2019, the last year that people were fully visiting, and thankfully the world is getting back to normal, we had 140,000 visitors that came through our JCC. Traditionally, Jews would come to Krakow and mourn and go to the camps and learn about the tragic loss of life in Poland, not so much about the history, and certainly not connecting to this rebirth of Jewish life, which is going on here. So people are still finding out they're Jewish. We are trying to reach out to all of them and say that you were cut off from the Jewish world because of the Holocaust, because of communism, and you have an opportunity today to be Polish and Jewish at the same time. You don't have to choose. Poland is a democratic place, very welcoming place for Jews because of all this fascinating, intense, non-Jewish interest in everything Jewish in Poland among many Poles, not all Poles, many Poles. That's created an environment that is absolutely conducive to Jewish life thriving once again. So Poland, a place of a long, complex Jewish history, a place of a recent, terrible, tragic Jewish history, has become one of the safest and easiest places in Europe to be Jewish once again. And that's because of Jews and non-Jews working together to rebuild Jewish life. And at a time of increased anti-Semitism in the world, this idea of Jewish life thriving not only in Israel, in the United States, in England, in places with large Jewish communities, but the idea of Jewish life thriving once again in Poland, a place of such recent tragedy, I think is a very powerful message and a message of hope and a message of strength, not only about the resilience of the Jewish community, but just about any community that goes through through trauma, as we have, is not written off even here in Krakow, an hour's drive from Auschwitz. So I think that's why we have so many visitors, because this message of hope and resilience is something that has captured the attention, captured the imagination of many people around the world. And that's normally where I would have stopped and said, thank you very much if you have any questions. But, a year ago, the whole world changed. Certainly our world here in Poland changed. We are 2.5 hours from the border in Krakow. And on February 24th, when we saw surprisingly what happened, we made a couple decisions. One, we put a big banner in front of over our gate, which is still there, saying "Welcome" in Ukrainian. We thought it would be up for a few days. It's been up for 12 months and a week. We made a decision that we are going to do all we can to help Ukraine, and we made a decision that we're going to help Jews and non-Jews equally. And that meant, first, it meant some people coming in to take food and clothing and diapers from an ad hoc pantry that we set up in the building, and that's become a full-fledged food and supply free store that's serving about 400 or 500 people a day. We were feeding people, and we said, wait a minute, where are they living? How are they being housed? So we started to house them. That became housing about 400 people a day. We've set up psychological services. We were operating on the border, inside Ukraine, sending supplies, safe space for women, daycare, language classes, psych support, job training, legal support, a full range of humanitarian aid. We've become really a humanitarian aid center. We went from 35 full-time employees to 75 full-time employees now. We are housing and feeding and supporting 1,000 Ukrainian refugees a day, and have so far helped 200,000 Ukrainian refugees, 98% of whom are not Jewish. We are doing this, one, because it's the right thing to do, but if we go a little deeper into that, we are doing this, part of the reason we're doing this is because that number of 6 million, that 6 million Jewish victims of the Holocaust, is a very high number because of indifference. Because 80 years ago, when the Jews were the primary victims, the world remained mostly silent. Yes, there were Poles that saved the Jews. Yes, people around Europe helped Jews. Yes, the United States at a very, very late point got involved. But for the most part, that 6 million number is so unbelievably high because the fate of the Jews was met with indifference. And 80 years later, when our Jewish community is being reborn and we see others suffering, we who, especially in this place of great suffering, we who know suffering so well, have a particular responsibility to try to present prevent the suffering of others, which is why our center has taken such a leading role, and why we've essentially, our center is more than double in size. And this money that we've spent, $10 million worth of aid distributed, that's over 5 times our whole annual budget. So we've grown exponentially. We thought it would last a few days or a week or a few weeks, and it's lasted a year. But we are in it for the long haul and are committed to doing all we can to continue to support Ukraine until the victory.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ornstein. That was a very inspiring and informative speech.
Nathan, please call me Jonathan, Nathan.
Yes, I was just calling you Mr. Ornstein, because it's a more formal event, obviously.
I know,
yes.
you're very formal, Nathan.
Yes. So you discussed a lot about, all the incredible things that the JCC has done to rebuild Jewish life in Poland, all its successes. And I would like to just ask if there have been any challenges, or what the challenges have been to rebuilding Jewish life in Poland.
Sure. I mean, the challenges may be obvious, but that people associate, from a Jewish perspective, people associate Poland with as a place of death. I tell people, oh, we have a preschool. They're like, what do you mean, Poland? Get out of there. As if, it's a, very scary place still to be Jewish. So the primary thing is that, I touched on in the very, very beginning, the main connotation for Jews around the world with Poland is loss and tragedy. And we're trying to change that. So that's been a challenge, that the main challenge, I would say.
How have efforts to rebuild Jewish life in Poland changed at all under the current Polish government that's been in power since 2015?
It hasn't changed what we do so much. It's changed in many ways how the world sees Poland. So I have to, before the war started, because of this bill that was passed and then essentially rescinded about talking about the Holocaust, the IPN bill, it meant that people have strong associations with Poland with anti-Semitism. I think a lot of them mistaken, some not mistaken. And, people don't have a neutral opinion. So when Poland does something, people are like, aha, we knew it. Poland is acting according to our expectations. And this government has done many things that hasn't made it easy. I think we have good relations with the government. I've met the president many, many times. He's been here as, with the first lady. But certain aspects of the way they deal with history, Holocaust history primarily, are difficult for us. And I think are rewriting our history. I think it's not in Poland's interest to pretend that the whole country was only focused on saving Jews between 1939 and 1945. There were some Poles who helped Jews and some Poles who hurt Jews, and that's fine. That's the history, and we need to accept it and move on. None of us are I think are caught in that history. And I think that by focusing so much only on the positive and denying in some ways the negative of what happened is not helpful to anybody. But on the ground, in terms of our day-to-day life, the government is not against us. We don't feel that the government is. We think things are still very safe here in Poland, and this current government, it doesn't prevent us from rebuilding Jewish life, although certain aspects of the government we might not agree with, and certain issues about restitution or about the Holocaust, Holocaust memory are things that are problematic, but life goes on.
You mentioned the 2018 Holocaust law that was, passed by the Polish government and then eventually rescinded due to, strong international criticism. And that's just been one of multiple diplomatic rifts that have arise between Israel and Poland. And I'm just curious, as the Jewish Community Center, but based in Poland, how does the JCC navigate diplomatic rifts between Israel and Poland?
So, luckily I don't have to focus too much, on that. I'm not a diplomat. So, I think Israel and Poland, I've been here for 20 years, and for most of that time, Poland was the best friend of Israel in the European Union. Well, Poland's been in the European Union for 19 of those years that I've been here. So for most of that time, Poland was a great friend, had great relations with Israel. And I think that there's a lot that they have in common. And sometimes that relationship, there's a complicated history between the Jewish people and, with Jewish people in Poland, and Israel as the nation state of the Jewish people, represents to some degree the Jewish people, and that can cause issues a little bit. But it's not, I think generally you're talking about countries that get along very, very well. If you go to a mall right now, any place in Poland, you're going to hear Hebrew, coming out of all the stores. There's a ton of tourism between the two countries, more and more on both sides, many, many flights. So I think there's cooperation on all different levels. But, sometimes the history can get in the way a little bit, but I think that relations are very good overall.
Thank you. You mentioned that there's a strong enthusiasm for the rebirth of Jewish life, and just general fascination with Jewish topics and culture and history in Poland, especially among non-Jewish Poles. And I know that you know about this because, of course, you were interviewed for her book, but Professor Geneviève Zubrzicki noted in her recent book, Resurrecting the Jew, Nationalism, Philo-Semitism, and Poland's Jewish Revival, that, that oftentimes this enthusiasm can spill over into Philo-Semitism, which, can often be kind of when Jewish culture is appropriated or caricatured. And I wanted to hear your thoughts on, Philo-Semitism and whether or not it's an issue and how Polish Jews go about navigating that.
Philo-Semitism is a good problem to have, right? In this part of the world, we'll take Philo-Semitism. I mean, sort of semi-joking, but I'm actually going to be at the University of Michigan with Geneviève next month. I'm speaking there and actually there's a Copernicus lecture that I'll be giving there, talking about some of these issues. People have said to me that, isn't Philo-Semitism just as bad as anti-Semitism, and two sides of the same coin? And maybe from an academic point of view, I can see that, but in the real world, my somewhat glib answer to that is I would rather have somebody chasing me down the street trying to kiss me for no reason than chasing me down the street trying to kill me for no reason. So I don't know that Philo-Semitism is just as bad as anti-Semitism, but yes, of course, you want people to see any individual or any group with all its complexity, right? And somebody who just thinks Jews are wonderful and everything they do is wonderful is, yes, slightly creepy. But better than somebody who's out to destroy them. But our goal is to be seen as a complex group of people with good sides and bad sides. There is so Philo-Semitism it depends how we define it, right? If you see it as something totally negative, then I can understand seeing it that way. But in my experience, the desire to connect to this people that it was almost completely destroyed, that was such a part of Poland for a long time, is natural. I think it would be strange. What I've come to understand is that it would be strange if you had a group of people that numbered up to 10% of the population living in a country for 1,000 years, and then that people was murdered and nobody spoke about it because the country was occupied for 50 years. Then after that occupation ended, you would hope that the remaining people would be interested in that group and would be fascinated in that group. And that's to some degree what's happening. So sometimes is it a little irritating? Are there things that I'm kind of like sometimes, well, that's a little creepy? Yes. Is it a main issue that I deal with? And of my time here, not much of my day is focusing on combating Philo-Semitism.
Also in Professor Zubrzicki's book, Resurrecting the Jew, she discusses how Polish Jews often feel out of place, both in Poland and among Jews from other countries. And I wanted to ask why you think that is, and what you think can be done to help Polish Jews feel more accepted, both in Poland and among non-Polish Jews.
I mean, I think, at this point, Poland is a very homogenous country, right? I think you can feel out of place if you're Jewish, but you can feel out of place if you're a person of color, if you're gay, if you're, almost anything except Polish, white, Catholic, because that's the vast majority of the country. So that is somewhat obvious as Poland becomes more multicultural, as the EU has opened up Poland, and there are more people living here and studying here and working here and staying here. Then that's this side of the equation. On the other side, Poland has been cut off from the Jewish world. So very often when, for years, the strength of the Jewish people and the ability to overcome adversity over the centuries has been our interconnectedness. We are treated poorly in a certain country, and we're able to go to a different country and get help there from our religionists, or from our, other Jews very often, and support us and help. And that's how the Jewish people, that's the solidarity, if you will, of the Jewish people is something that is very helpful. And Poles have been disconnected from that because of the Holocaust and because of communism. And if people meet a Polish Jew very often in the United States or in Israel or even here, they're surprised. Wait, you're Jewish? You're living in Poland? What are you doing here? So I think that's a real problem, is that the Jews in Poland are a tiny minority and can feel odd being in this homogenous culture, but then they feel like they're a historical oddity to the Jewish world that expected all the Polish Jews to either be killed or leave after not being killed. But this is changing. That's why we want people to visit us. That's why it's such an important aspect of what we do, this visitor center aspect, that people come to Poland and they don't only see death camps, and they don't only visit the ghetto and go to Schindler's Museum, that when they're in Krakow, they see the history, they see the tragedy of the Holocaust, they see hundreds of years of history, and then they see this rebirth of Jewish life. So that's a major part of our mission, is trying to make young Jews in Poland feel good in Poland, and also feel good and accepted in the Jewish world.
In a similar vein, have you noticed that when people tour and visit Poland's Museum of the History of Polish Jews, as you said, are also known as Polin, are people surprised that Polish Jewish history is more than just the Holocaust, and that in fact it goes back 1,000 years, and that sometime, at least at some, if not a decent amount of that time, it was actually the two groups coexisted and even maybe thrived at times?
Absolutely. I think people are surprised, and I think that's the importance of the museum, which is that it's not a Holocaust museum, right? The Holocaust is one of, I think, 7 sections of the museum, of the exhibition. I think it might be the largest, but still, absolutely, the Holocaust is part of Polish Jewish history. So the Holocaust is part of a Polish Jewish history museum, and I think that my job here, our jobs here, are made much easier by having the Polish Museum doing what it's doing and showing people, wait a minute, this is the Jews have been living here for a long time, and and seeing the complexity of it. So I always, if I'm arranging somebody's itinerary, and we have a big visitor services department here, and we help people visit and arrange everything that they might need, is that in my vision of that, people go to Warsaw first for a day, spend the whole day in the Polish Museum, and then they want to see anything else in Warsaw, I guess there's other stuff to see, but as a longtime Krakowian married to a woman from Krakow, I reject most things outside of Krakow, and then come to Krakow, right? So you go to Warsaw and you get the backdrop of everything, be prepped for what you're going to see by seeing the Polish Museum, and then whatever you're going to see inside the country, you can go see it afterwards.
Thank you. One of the major themes of your speech was how so many Poles are discovering that they are either Jewish or have some Jewish heritage. I'm curious how most of those Poles react, at least the ones that come to the JCC, when they discover that.
So I'm getting, it's an interesting question. I'm getting, if you think about it, a self-selecting group of people, right? There are people that maybe find that information out and are hiding in their own closet because they can't believe it and terrified and never tell anybody, but I'll never know about those people, right? So I get the people here that have made the decision to come here. So it's not a fair representation, really. That being said, I think the people that I come into contact with, again, the fact that I come into contact with them is part of the story, though, are interested, are fascinated by that, but not everybody is. And some people might find out that they have Jewish roots and not, not do anything with it ever, or not do anything with it for a long time. I've had people who've known they were Jewish for years and years and years and not done anything with it, and then something sparks their interest. There was, I'll tell you a quick story. There was a couple Israeli football players, soccer players, on a team in Krakow. And there was a guy who knew he was Jewish his whole life, but never involved, never really doing anything. But he was a huge soccer fan. And he started to come to our Shabbat dinners because sometimes those soccer players would come and he wanted to talk to them and sit next to them. And that was his entry back into Judaism. And he became very, very involved in all Jewish life because that was the thing that spoke to him. So you never know what's going to connect to people. And we try to just, put everything out there that we can. And then people find their way. And, what's another aspect of it, though, is what does it mean if someone finds out that they have a Jewish parent, let's say, and they walk into my office? What do I tell them? Do they have to go and talk to a rabbi? Do they go to Israel? Do they learn Hebrew? Do they learn about the Torah? Like, what do you say to somebody who's just finding out that they're Jewish and has this family history of being, Polish Jewish and the Holocaust and all of that? So, I'll answer my own question, which is we try to focus on community. We try to say to those people, there are other people finding out, many other people. I say, listen, my wife found out. And it's, it's something that's natural. And, it doesn't mean you have to give up being Polish. You can be Polish and Jewish, of course. And there's a whole complicated, deep, fascinating Jewish world out there. And you can find whatever you want inside it, and we'll help you.
One of my last questions on the rebuilding of Jewish life topic is, and I wasn't going to originally, ask this because it's just a bit of a darker topic, but you mentioned 1968, which obviously I think was one of the main, anti-Semitic aftershocks post-Holocaust that really, as you mentioned, led to a major Jewish flight from Poland. And I wanted to ask you about another one of those events that happened a little bit earlier, 1946, the Kielce pogrom, and why you think that event also was so had such a strong effect on the strong impact on the Jewish community and led to a large exodus from Poland.
Yeah, the Kielce pogrom was a seminal event in terms of determining the trajectory of Polish Jewish post-war community. You still had the chaos going on after World War II and what was happening with the new state here, and you have a pogrom with Jews murdered in a horrible way. There was a trial, but not a really one that would stand up to what things we would expect today. And I think for many Jews, that was like, what, we're out of here. That was sort of if they weren't sure, anybody that was on the fence about whether Poland was going to be a hospitable place for Jews after the war, I think that was seen as a message to them that how much, what else would you have needed to see? And that was responsible for massive emigration of the remaining Jews in Poland a year later, after the war ended. People were just still finding got to understand, it's not like the war ended and 3 days later, everybody was back in place, right? It took forever in the chaos of post-war Europe for people to get back to where they were from. And most Jews that survived, it's always worth noting that the largest amount of Jews, there were 3 ways for Jews to survive, right? You could survive in a camp, very few survived, right? The camps were very efficient. 2, you could survive being hidden, small numbers. It wasn't easy to be hidden, it wasn't easy to hide. didn't happen that much, or you survived by fleeing east or being arrested by the Soviets when they came into Poland and arrested Jews and sent them off into the Gulag and Kazakhstan and places like that. And that was the vast majority of Polish Jews that survived in the east and then made their way back. So Polish Jews that didn't have this Holocaust experience of being in Poland, occupied Poland during the Holocaust, right? They spent the Holocaust, they understood at that point what happened, but they spend years in Kazakhstan and places like that. They come back to Poland and they see Jews murdered for being Jews. And that for them was, that's it, we're done.
Thank you. To now transition over to the questions regarding the JCC's humanitarian efforts with Ukrainian refugees. So just to start us off with the kind of more general, broad question and kind of getting a sense of how things are going on the ground right now in Poland. As you mentioned, just a little over a year after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, how is Poland coping with the Ukrainian refugee crisis?
Surprisingly well. If you would have told me that this was going on a year later, I would have said, I can't believe Ukraine is sticking it to the Russians in terms of militarily. I can't believe that Poland still has, 1.5 to 2 million refugees living here. That Polish society is still incredibly welcoming and generous in terms of, welcoming these refugees into their midst. It's shocking that we're still in this situation, but it's been amazing. I think that the Polish people should get a Nobel Peace Prize for the way they've welcomed the entire Polish nation. Should get a Nobel Peace Prize for the way they have welcomed Ukrainian refugees and continue a year later to welcome Ukrainian refugees.
One of the things that we discussed today is how the JCC has welcomed, as you said, 200,000 or helped 200,000 Ukrainians in some capacity. And while that's extraordinary, it kind of raises the question of whether you think that governments, specifically like the Polish and American governments, and the international community at large, should be doing more to support Ukraine to help, ease the burden on NGOs like the JCC.
Right, Nathan's very smart question. Of course, that's the follow-up question to wait. Why is a tiny JCC in Krakow that normally is, a budget under $2 million, spending, raising and spending all this money to help and still housing and feeding, 1,000 people a day? Yes, the answer is that the Polish government is stretched very thin. I don't expect the Polish government, to be able to pay for everything that's going on in the country. I think the United States is focused primarily on military aid, although and it's up to the private sector and individuals to do a lot in Poland and for the aid coming into Poland. It terrifies me that, people ask, oh, but the border is quiet, there aren't Ukrainians coming in anymore, so what are you still doing? As if, because the assumption is, I think, for Americans, that in the early days of when people are pouring across the border, then there's chaos and they need help. But then once people are already settled in the country, then the government kind of takes over. But that's not the case here, right? The government is housing, less than 10,000 of 100,000 refugees in Krakow. At a certain point, it was less than 10,000 out of the 150,000 refugees that were in Krakow. So the government is giving free, you can send your kids to school, you can be part of the healthcare system, you can work, but I don't think there's much money left for the government to give after that. And that's why we're doing what we're doing. I wish there were more money to be distributed, but we're in the situation that we're in. Poland is not a very rich country to begin with, and has spent billions and billions of dollars, and the cost of having these people here and allowing them to participate in the social welfare system is tremendous. But the thing that really scares me is that we're housing these people. Everyone we're housing now is special needs, in some sense, either very old or disabilities, and autism, and blind, and the blindness, all these things that make it very difficult to be on their own. And there's no real safety net below us. That's just the nature of the society here. If we aren't helping these people, then there's no one else to help them.
As discussed, over 98% of the Ukrainians who have received support from the JCC have been non-Jewish. I think, it's probably logical to assume that for at least some of those Ukrainians, their experience at the JCC has been their first, exposure to Jewish people and life and culture. And I'm curious whether or not you've seen any, what their reactions have been to meeting Jewish people and the kindness that JCC has shown them, and whether or not there's been any, myth busting.
I mean, I would think so. We don't, if somebody comes in and takes food, they were not, we just don't have the capacity to spend hours with each person. But everybody coming in, I think, is aware that it's a Jewish building. We have signs up in Ukrainian everywhere. We're happy for them to know that the Jewish community is helping them. We don't hit them over the head with it. We're not doing it to show them that we're Jewish. We're doing it because it's the right thing. It's the right thing to do and in line with our values. If that helps them have a positive opinion of Jews, then great. A lot of people around the world historically have not been very nice to the Jews. So if this gives people a more positive impression, and then great. We had I'll tell you one quick story. Is there was a woman that we helped who then went back to Kyiv and was talking to her parents and grandparents there, and she came back and told me, oh, when I went back home and said how I'd received this aid from the Jewish Community Center, her grandmother said, you received that aid, you were helped because during the war we hid a Jewish family for 2 years, and now this is now we're getting paid back for those good deeds. So you never know.
That's an incredible story. You mentioned that the JCC's humanitarian efforts coincide with Jewish values, and I was wondering if you could just elaborate a little bit more as to specifically, which of those Jewish values the JCC's humanitarian efforts align with, just especially maybe for our non-Jewish listeners that would like to learn a little bit more about Jewish values.
Yeah, I mean, I think these are universal values. I mean, certainly, the idea of Abraham welcoming strangers into the tent is something that's very strong, and it's not only Jewish. This is a Judeo-Christian, Muslim idea of welcoming and welcoming the stranger. So this is important. There's a concept in the Jewish world, which many of us see as central to Judaism, which is something which in Hebrew is called tikkun olam. Tikkun olam is in Hebrew means repairing the world. This idea that the world is a fundamentally broken place, and it's up to all of us to do what we can to try to fix it. There's a beautiful idea in the Talmud, which is sort of the book of commentary about Jewish laws, of discussion going on over the centuries between different sages and rabbis, which says that although it's not the expectation that you finish the work, it doesn't mean that because you can't finish it, it's not an excuse not to begin and do your share. So these are the things that we have very much in our heads, but always not necessarily Jewish values, but always this idea of Jewish history and our own specific Polish Jewish history on our minds, which is, had we received more help 80 years ago, 90% of Polish Jewry wouldn't have been murdered. And such a large percentage of European Jewry murdered. And now we, hopefully we can learn from our own history. We paid a very high price for that. And I hope that we learned, and I hope that the world learned from what it means to be indifferent. And this idea of the 11th commandment is don't be indifferent. And we take that very seriously here in Krakow.
My final question is, I was asking about how, NGOs like the JCC have really stepped up during this, crisis, this war with Russia's war on Ukraine, and we both kind of came to the agreement that it would be ideal if governments could do more. But I'm curious, are there certain ways in which the JCC, for example, and other NGOs like it can actually help Ukrainians better than governments can?
I mean, governments can provide funding, which, there might be individual NGOs have certain skills that governments generally don't have. and are dealing with people on a certain level. I think what governments have is a size and a scale and an ability to fund, right? So it's not, I don't know that it's, I think that a great model would be the government funding NGOs to do a lot of these things. And sometimes that is the model. For us, it's private individuals and Jewish and non-Jewish. We started to be supported. We have 11 members of the Mormon Church are coming tonight for Shabbat dinner. They've started now supporting our work here with Ukraine. So it's not only Jews supporting us, people around the world, but yeah, it's instead of governments funding NGOs, it's individuals and essentially individuals funding NGOs.
Well, thank you so very much, Jonathan, for your time and wisdom. From the outside looking in my opinion, I really believe that you are the individual that's leading Poland's Jewish revival. And as a proud Pole and Jew, I want to thank you for everything that you've done and you continue to do. And I wanted to say Shabbat Shalom.
Thank you, Nathan. I continue to be impressed and inspired by you, and I hope that we'll have lots of things to do together. Lots of cooperation in our futures.
Likewise. Thank you very much.
Thank you, my friend. Shabbat Shalom.
Shalom. Take care.
Be well.